I've now been running a US LLC as a resident of the UAE for more than 2 years. In fact, right now I run 2 separate US LLCs as payment processing companies. But what I haven't covered a lot on this channel is some considerations, some things that you need to be aware of if you are looking to set up a US LLC while living in Dubai. There's of course many benefits to this. Mainly it's going to be payment processing with a UAE company, which you're probably going to have as the holding company or the main company, or at least a company to get you residence in the UAE. In this video, I'm going to give you the 5 things that I wish I knew before setting up and running a US LLC from Dubai. But if you don't consider all of this, you might end up with some very hefty fines, either in the US or in the UAE, or some other issues that you would get from not understanding some of these things. Before we move on, if you're looking to set up a US LLC, as always, I highly recommend that you don't try to do this with the IRS yourself. You should absolutely use a reputable service provider who knows what they're doing, who's done this thousands of times, so you don't have to worry about any of these things. The one that I recommend, that I've used now 2 times, is called Dula. They are probably one of the most reputable service providers in the market. What they will essentially do is set up your US LLC in whatever state you want, whether you have 1 member or multiple members, whatever you want, and they actually understand how to set it up so that you have your UAE company as the owner, if that is how you prefer to set it up. And then as long as you select at least a total compliance package, which I use myself, and I highly recommend, they're also going to take care of all of the many filings that you have throughout the lifetime of your business. Because while it is easy and simple to run the US LLC, there are still a lot of filings that you are going to have to do. And this is again something that you don't want to try to do on your own, that you don't want to do wrong, because the fines with the IRS are $25,000 for even one of these things that you miss or you do incorrectly. So in my opinion, it's always best to pay a little bit more, to outsource these things to someone else, and then you focus your time as the entrepreneur on actually making money. So if you're looking to set up a US LLC, I recommend you check out Dula in the first link down below in the description and use my code DulaThomas10 for 10% off. And by the way, none of this video is tax advice. I'm not a tax advisor. I cannot give you tax advice. This is just my personal experience. And that is also again why I recommend Dula, because if you use the services, you actually get access to a proper US CPA who can actually give you real tax advice in case you do have a specific questions around US taxes and things like that with the US LLC. Now, the first thing to consider is, do you even need one? Now, in many cases, you are going to want to set one up if you have any business with US customers. If you take any kind of payments from the US, you're probably going to want to have a US LLC just to process those payments. And even if it's not from the US, generally US companies just have much lower decline rates from anywhere in the world. And the fact that you are going to have less declines means that you just make more money. And if you just have even a little bit of revenue going through this company, it's going to more than make up for whatever it costs for you to set it up. And considering how low effort they are to run, in many cases, it's just going to be a no-brainer to have one. But there are going to be cases where it is not going to make sense. So if you don't take payment from customers, you don't do business with US clients who are going to have a problem with sending money to a UAE company, then you might not need one. So this is always case by case. And you also want to consider, okay, do you want to have this US LLC owned by your UAE company, or do you even need a UAE company? Do you want to have it just owned by yourself personally, and you perhaps get residency in the UAE in some other ways, like with a golden visa or something like that? So there's always these considerations that are always case by case. And just because I have set things up in this way, it doesn't mean that you should. The second thing to consider is, do you have a US operation? So obviously, the reason why we use a US LLC outside of those payment processing things is that you get 0% tax in the US if you are yourself a non-US resident. But that comes with an asterisk. And the asterisk is that you get 0% tax in the US unless you have what is called US effectively connected income. And many people don't consider this. They will go ahead and hire someone in the US, hire a contractor even in the US, or have a warehouse in the US for their e-commerce business. And this is going to create physical US operations, which is going to be taxed in the US. And that is just something that you need to consider. You need to make sure you don't create any connection to the US. And by the way, having US customers is going to be fine, most likely, but just any operations you want to avoid. If you really need to have them, let's say you need to have a warehouse in the US, you need to have someone working there, what you probably want to do is set up a separate US LLC as a staffing company and essentially only isolate those parts of the business to that staffing company, and then have that staffing company be owned by your UAE company, your holding company, or whatever, and you just send whatever whatever money that company needs to that company, and that company deals with all US operations and it's going to be taxed in the US, but that essentially avoid your main LLC or your main company from being dragged into the US tax net. So that is again something you need to plan carefully. The third thing to consider is UAE taxes. So again, I mentioned this in a bunch of videos, but still many people don't know this. Just because you set up a US LLC outside of the UAE doesn't mean that you can get away from the UAE 9% corporate tax. Now they have a small business exemption on the UAE corporate tax, where if your total revenue for your business is below 816,000 US dollars a year, then the corporate tax doesn't apply to you. But if you are above that, if you would have to pay, and by the way, the threshold is based on your revenue, but the tax itself is obviously only applied on your profit, your US LLC is going to be liable for the taxes. And even if you don't actually have to pay the corporate tax, you still have to register any companies that are managed and controlled from the UAE. And I made a detailed video telling you exactly how you can register your company for UAE corporate tax, whether it's a UAE company or a US LLC or whatever structure. The fourth thing to consider is US withholding tax on royalties. Now, this is not strictly related to having a US LLC, but I wanted to include this here. It's because many people think that you can set up a US LLC, which is a US entity, to get away from the withholding tax that the US is going to apply on things like US sourced royalties or US sourced dividends and things like that. A common example of this is YouTube AdSense. Any AdSense revenue that you earn from US based US is going to have a 30% withholding tax at source in the US before it reaches your bank account in the UAE, and that is because the US and UAE do not have a tax treaty. But many people think, oh, I can just set up a US LLC and the US LLC gets the AdSense and that means I don't have to pay this withholding tax. But that is not how it works, because the withholding tax is based on where the beneficial owner of that income is tax resident. So if you and the US LLC are tax resident in the UAE, having the US LLC essentially doesn't help you. You still have to pay the withholding tax. So that is just something to keep in mind. If you are a UAE resident personally and with the company, it doesn't matter whether you have a US LLC or whatever structure, you're going to have to pay that withholding tax. And by the way, any money you pay from your US LLC, you're not going to have to pay this withholding tax on, because money that is paid from the US LLC is not a dividend, it is a distribution, because for US tax purposes, the US LLC is not a taxable entity, so you don't have to worry about that. The fifth thing to consider is for your UAE company, if you have one, and that is the UAE holding company ESR regulations. So what the hell is this? So essentially in the UAE, there are these economic substance regulations that apply to certain kinds of companies. And let's say you have your structure set up in such a way that you have your US LLC, that is the operating company that does all of the operations, and then you have that be owned by your UAE company that is only a holding company. Essentially, the UAE company doesn't have any operations besides holding shares in your US LLC, and then the UAE company just pays you. I actually don't recommend setting things up in this way, because holding companies actually have to undergo these economic substance regulations. Essentially, for certain kinds of companies, and you can see on the screen the different kinds of companies, the UAE has essentially additional compliance that you're going to have to file every single year, and a holding company is one of these. But the crucial thing here is that holding company is defined such that it is a company that only engages in holding shares and receiving dividends and things like that. So if your UAE company has any other active operations, it's not going to be classed as a holding company for these ESR regulations. So what I recommend doing, if at all possible, if you're going to have your UAE company on your US LLC, make sure that your UAE company has at least some operations on its own, so you're not going to have to do this additional compliance. Now, if you have to do it, it's not the biggest deal in the world, but it's just something I think almost no one is actually aware of, and you could be illegally not doing this additional filing and risking a lot of fines. Hence, what I recommend doing is either have the US LLC owned by yourself personally, so the UAE company is not a holding company, or not even having a UAE company, let's say you get a golden visa or something like that, or having it like I do, where the UAE company does own the US LLC, but the UAE company itself also has operations, so it doesn't get classed as a holding company. So these are some of the things that you should be aware of when you're running a US LLC in the UAE. Let me know down below if you already knew of all of these, or if there was some of them that you didn't know about, and let me know what other things you would like to know about running a US LLC and things like that. And again, if you want to set one up, you can use the first link down below in the description to set up a US LLC with Dula. With that, if you're interested to hear more details around the structure of US LLC with a Dubai company, and specifically why I use this specific structure, you can watch this video right here. So watch that video next. I'll see you in the next one.